Michael stood in the frozen food aisle when the sound slipped out of him, a short, thoughtless laugh, the kind you regret before it even leaves your mouth. He wasn't mocking the woman stacking cans of beans. Not really. But the name tag pinned crookedly on her chest carried a word that didn't seem like a name at all. It looked more like a fragment, half familiar, a collection of letters that belonged somewhere else, carved into something older than this store, older than him. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even glance at him, but her eyes lifted in a way that made his stomach turn cold, as if she had heard him without sound. And then she whispered not to him, not to anyone but... The air seemed to bend toward her lips. No one else in that aisle reacted. Not a single shopper turned. Michael couldn't tell if she had spoken aloud, or if he had only heard it inside his skull. That's when you notice it, too. Not the whisper itself, you couldn't repeat it, even if you tried, but the strange weight of it. The way your own memory clenches around the sound as though it doesn't want you to remember. And for a moment, you feel almost complicit, like you were standing there beside Michael, sharing in a mistake you shouldn't have witnessed. Because only a few hours later, after she vanished from the store without a trace, after the employees claimed they'd never had anyone by that name on staff, Michael drove home down Main Street and slammed his brakes in the middle of traffic. There it was, the same word, the same impossible name, mounted in iron above a building he had driven past 100 times without ever noticing, the letters heavy and black against the gray stone. It shouldn't have been there. Not in this town. Not anywhere. Yet, there it was, like it had been waiting for him all along. And as he sat, frozen behind the wheel, horns blaring behind him, he saw a shadow move inside the building's dark windows, a figure pausing just long enough to look back at him. His chest tightened with a recognition he couldn't explain, because it wasn't the woman from the store at all, it was someone he thought he had buried years ago. Would you like me to continue this opening into a full unfolding scene where the truth behind that name begins to surface or keep the mystery hovering, unresolved, like a forbidden memory that shouldn't be touched? Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles drained white. The sound of blaring horns stretching into something less like traffic and more like a recording caught on a loop. Faint skips and cracks running through the air. He blinked hard. Once. Twice. And the figure in the window of that gray building dissolved into nothing more than his own reflection in the windshield. The iron letters above the door still burned into his vision. The same word the grocery woman had worn on her chest. The same word that shouldn't exist in any directory or census, but sat there carved in stone as if it had been waiting centuries for him to finally notice. He pulled forward, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to keep driving, but something in the silence of the car pressed too close. The radio had been off, he was certain, but a voice bled faintly through the speakers anyway, broken by static like a fragment of a voicemail, a woman's tone, fragile and raw, saying his name only once before cutting off mid-breath. Michael slammed the volume knob with the heel of his hand, and the voice vanished instantly, leaving him unsure if it had been there at all. By the time he reached his apartment, his memory already betrayed him. He told himself he'd driven past the building dozens of times. But when he tried to picture its windows, the cracked stone at the corners, the heavy iron letters, the images in his mind shifted, inconsistent, never the same twice. Sometimes the sign was smaller, crooked, hanging by a chain. Other times it was massive, carved into the wall itself. Each detail contradicted the last. When he looked down at his phone to search the name, his browser history already showed he'd looked it up before 3 different times, on 3 different dates stretching back months. He had no memory of ever doing that. That night, Michael sat in the dark, staring at his ceiling, when a knock echoed against his door. Too soft, too slow, like someone only pretending to knock. He almost ignored it, until a voice followed a low, familiar drawl. It was Andrew, a man Michael hadn't spoken to in years. Not since college, not since the kind of falling out that cut deeper than family betrayals. Andrew had a way of making every story feel like a confession, and Michael had once trusted him more than anyone. Right up until the day Andrew vanished from his life without warning. Now here he was, standing in Michael S.'s doorway like he had simply walked out for cigarettes and returned a decade later. Andrew stepped inside without waiting for permission, eyes darting around the apartment, taking in the mess of papers, the laptop left open, the uneaten food on the counter. His smile was warm, but wrong, like it had been practiced too many times. He said he'd been nearby, said he'd heard Michael had seen something strange. The words stuck in Michael's throat. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet, but Andrew leaned closer, lowering his voice, and whispered, "Asterisk, it always starts with the name." The air thickened. Michael demanded to know what he meant. How he knew. Andrew didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled an old cassette tape from his coat pocket, slid it onto the coffee table, and pushed it toward him. "You've heard her already," Andrew said softly. "You just don't remember." Michael stared at the tape, heart pounding, because he recognized it instantly. He owned no cassette player, hadn't seen one in years, but the handwriting scrawled across the label was his own. His own handwriting, but slanted, jittery, like he'd written it in a panic. Like he'd tried to scratch the word down before it slipped from his memory. When he demanded answers, Andrew only laughed quiet. Almost condensed, said memory was never the thing they thought it was. He spoke about loops and corrections and the way some names were never meant to be spoken aloud. Because once you said them, you became part of the story, whether you wanted to or not. Michael pressed him, desperate, but Andrew's replies twisted back on themselves, leaving him more confused than before. Later that night, after Andrew had left, without saying goodbye, Michael sat alone with the cassette. He told himself he wouldn't listen. Not yet, but his hands betrayed him. He borrowed a cheap player from a neighbor, slid the tape inside, and pressed play. At first, only static. Then, faintly, underneath, a voices are recounting events he didn't remember living. Standing in the grocery store, hearing the woman whisper, driving past the building. Even this very moment of sitting alone with the cassette, the recording ended with him saying words that weren't his own. Asterisk, she never left. Michael, she's been inside the walls this whole time. The room spun. He checked the walls, tapped at them like a fool, half expecting an answer. That's when he noticed the clock on the wall frozen at the wrong time, its second hand twitching uselessly. His phone showed at the same time, stuck, refusing to move forward. He stared until his eyes watered, and when finally the hand ticked forward, the relief was cut short by a new dread because... For a split second, the face in the reflection of the glass was not his own but hers. The woman from the store. Her crooked name tag hanging in the shadows of his living room. And just as quickly, it was gone. Michael sat there in the silence, trembling, wondering if the truth behind what they don't want you to remember was something far worse than ghosts, worse than madness. Because maybe the name wasn't meant to remind him of her at all. Maybe it was meant to remind him of himself. Would you like me to keep unfolding? This left turn further showing? How? Andrew begins contradicting Michael's memories directly, or keep the story locked in this haze where the audience can tell if Michael is losing his grip on reality or discovering a hidden history no one once revealed. Michael thought he had cracked it. For the first time in days, his chest loosened, his hands stopped trembling, and the chaos inside his head flattened into something that resembled a straight line. The tape? The voice? The building? The woman he strung them together like beads on a cord, each detail feeding into the next until it almost made sense? Andrew had returned to warn him the whisper in the store had been the first signal, and the building was the key something about its history, some old story he had ignored, but was now finally brave enough to look at. He told himself the only reason he had remembered before was because no one had wanted him to. That's how he framed it, in words he could believe. Asterisk, you're not crazy, they lied to you. It was the lie that burned, the lie that turned every strange moment into proof. For the first time, he didn't feel hunted. He felt close to uncovering the hidden truth. He went to the library, a place he hadn't stepped into since high school, where dust clung to the blinds and the old microfilm machine sat humming like it still mattered. He typed in the name, the same name he'd laughed at in the store. The one iron branded onto the stone building, and there it was, headline after headline. A family name that carried weight a century ago. Tied to property, politics, even missing persons reports. There were whispers of a fire, an inheritance dispute, a scandal hushed by the town council. A woman's face appeared in a grainy newspaper photograph, unsmiling, eyes that seemed to follow him across the page. Michael's pulse quickened, because he swore he had seen that face before, not in the papers, but somewhere closer. As if she had passed him on the street last winter, or stood behind him in line at the bank. He left the library, convinced he'd found at the root of everything. He thought the mystery uncovered was nothing more than the town burying its past, and he was only unlucky enough to stumble into the cracks they had tried to seal. He told himself the whispers were echoes, the voices a trick of memory, and the tape a warning he had left for himself when he'd gotten too close before. It was clean. It was logical. And for a few hours, Michael walked lighter, as if he had finally opened the forbidden file and seen that it was only dust inside. But memory doesn't hold steady when it's tampered with. That night, Michael dreamed a dream that wasn't his own. He was small again, a boy standing in a long hallway lined with doors, each one painted the same dull red. A woman's hand clutched his shoulder, pulling him toward one of the doors, whispering that if he opened it, he would never forget. He turned the knob, and the door swung inward to reveal a grocery aisle can stacked neatly. Fluorescent lights buzzing above, and the woman kneeling on the floor, name tag pinned to her chest, looking up at him like she had been waiting decades for him to arrive. He woke gasping, throat raw, sweat soaking the sheets. The clock read 3:17. The same wrong time he had seen before. By morning, the false resolution unraveled. He pulled out the library photocopies to reassure himself, but every article had shifted. The headlines were scrambled, letters in the name transposed, dates that made no sense. The woman's face in the photo was no longer there. It all just a blank oval where features should be. Michael thought his mind was fracturing, until he noticed something worse. The handwriting in the margins. Scribbled notes that weren't his, circling words and underlining dates. The ink was fresh, he hadn't written them, but the slant of the penmanship mirrored his own. Exactly. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, tucked behind the hum of the refrigerator. But soon it grew louder, a soft shuffle, like someone pacing in the next room. He called out, voice cracking, but no one answered. When he checked, the room was empty. Still, the sound persisted. Not from the floorboards, not from the walls, but from inside his head. Footsteps circling, pausing, waiting. That was when Andrew reappeared, sudden as a shadow. Michael demanded explanations, desperate now, but Andrew only smiled with pity and said he was proud of him for getting this far. He insisted Michael had already solved it. The truth was exactly what he thought. The scandal, the inheritance, the family name rotting in the town's history. He spoke with such conviction that Michael almost believed him again. But then Andrew slipped. He said the fire had happened in 1922. Michael froze, heart lurching. Because the article had listed 1918. When he pointed it out, Andrew didn't falter, didn't correct himself. He simply stared at Michael, silent, a flicker of something cruel in his eyes, as if he had been caught pretending. That single detail collapsed everything. The resolution dissolved like sugar in water, leaving Michael sick with dread. If Andrew had lied about the date, what else had he lied about? Had he even gone to the library? Or was that memory just another loop? Another planted image meant to keep him docile. And then the past broke through in a way Michael couldn't deny. A memory surfaced not from the library, not from dreams, but from his own childhood. He was 12, walking home from school, when he saw a woman step out of the very building he had braked in front of days ago. She looked directly at him, smiled faintly, and whispered his name, though he'd never met her before. He had told his parents about it that night, shaken, but they'd laughed it off. Told him it must have been a neighbor he didn't recognize. He had believed them. He had let the memory fade. But now it came back in full color, sharper than anything else in his past. Undeniable. It had been her. The same face, the same eyes, unchanged by time. Michael's stomach twisted as the deeper force revealed itself, not in words, not in a shape he could describe, but in the sense that none of this had begun with him. It had been there since the first time he noticed something out of place, since the moment as a boy when he looked up and saw a stranger who knew his name. The steps circling in his mind quickened, closing in, and he realized with horror that this was never about the grocery woman or the building or the scandal buried in town records. It was about the way his life had been bent around a truth too large to see. A truth that had been watching, waiting, shaping his memories into something that would keep him from looking too close. He tried to push it away, to tell himself he was only unraveling from a lack of sleep. But when he looked at the stack of papers again, the blank oval where the woman's face had been now carried a faint outline he's forming, a mouth half drawn. It was becoming clearer, as if the paper itself was remembering what he had tried to forget. And then, just as the fear reached its peak, Michael noticed something he hadn't before. In the corner of every article, beneath the blurred text and shifting dates, was a small initial his own, not typed, not printed, but signed in his own hand. Each one different. Each one written in a moment he couldn't recall. The realization split him open. This wasn't researched someone else had hidden. This was his. He had done this before. He had lived through this already. And if that was true, then everything you've just watched, every detail, every whisper, every supposed discovery was not the beginning of the story at all. It was the rewatch. The second loop, the same trap, tightening again. Would you like me to take this into Chapter 4, where Michael begins to test his own reality with recordings and mirrors? Or keep the story suffocating here, locked in the horror of knowing he may never be seeing this for the first time? Michael could no longer convince himself that the shifting memories and warped reflections belonged only to him. The stack of papers on his table had multiplied overnight, spilling onto the floor in patterns, too precise to be accidental, their edges forming circles within circles. Some pages carried messages written in unfamiliar hands but signed with his name. Others bore faint symbols that seemed to fade when he looked at them too long. At first, he thought it was another trick of his unraveling mind. But then a knock came at the door, slow and deliberate, and when he opened it, there was no one there, only a slip of paper tucked beneath the frame. It was written in neat block letters. "You were right all along." The words shouldn't have rattled him the way they did. They were simple, almost kind, yet his throat closed around them, because he knew he hadn't told anyone the truth. He hadn't confessed his suspicion that this wasn't madness but a pattern, a loop replayed in lives beyond his own. He hadn't spoken aloud, the thought that had been gnawing at him in the silence, that maybe the woman in the store, the voice on the cassette, and the figure in the window were only fragments of a larger story stitched across different people, who had each been forced to carry a piece. If someone else knew that, if someone else was leaving him notes, then he wasn't alone. But the idea that others were involved only deepened the dread, because it meant the force that had bent his life was wider, watching more than just him. That night, the dream came again, but this time it was not his alone. He was standing in the hallway of red doors, but there were others beside him. Shapes without faces, their outlines flickering like old film. They reached for the knobs too, but each door opened onto a different scene. A hospital corredor courtroom, a child's bedroom in the dark. And in each space, the same crooked name appeared, carved into the wall or whispered through the air. When he woke, his phone buzzed with an unread text from an unknown number. It contained only a photograph of a door he had never seen, painted the same dull red, with the words "Don't forget again" etched above the frame. The timestamp claimed it had been sent 20 years ago. The paranoia seeped deeper. He began to notice marks in public place, sip-chalk symbols scrawled on sidewalks, etched into bus-stop benches, carved faintly into the wood of library tables. They were small, forgettable too, most, but once he noticed them, he couldn't unsee them. A spiral with a line through its center. An eye with no pupil. A name misspelled in the same way each time. And each time he found one, someone nearby would glance at him too long, their eyes widening as though they recognized him, as though they were waiting for him to acknowledge it. He started to wonder if the others who had lived through this loop had left traces for him, breadcrumbs across years, or if the force itself was scattering them to taunt him. It was Andrew who broke the silence first. He appeared in the grocery store one afternoon, standing too still in the frozen aisle, waiting for Michael to notice him. When their eyes met, Andrew didn't smile. He only whispered, "Asterix, they're watching this too." Michael wanted to demand answers, to force him to explain, but Andrew raised a finger to his lips and turned away, leaving without groceries, without acknowledgement from anyone else in the store. Later, Michael checked the security camera footage online, but the recordings for that day skipped, freezing for entire minutes before resuming, as if someone had cut away the evidence of Andrew's presence. Michael tried to anchor himself in something solid, but even his own reflection rebelled. in the bathroom mirror, his face blurred at the edges, hairline shifting, jawline narrowing, as if the glass wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. Once, in the shimmer of the window at night, he caught sight of someone behind him, a tall woman, with eyes too dark to reflect light, standing just over his shoulder. He spun around and found nothing. But when he looked back at the glass, words were scrawled faintly across the surface in condensation. "We remember you." It was then that the third voice emerged. Not in person, but in writing. A series of emails arrived from an untraceable account. Subject lines blank, each message containing only 1 or 2 sentences. Asterisk found footage from 20 years ago. Look closely at the boy in the frame. Or... Asterisk, what the government never released is already inside your house. The messages carried no signature, but the tone was different from Andrew's evasions, different from the whispers of the dreams. This voice was steady, precise, cutting through the noise with a coldness that felt more honest than anything else. Yet the honesty was unbearable, because it implied the events were documented, archived, replayed. If there was footage from 20 years ago, then the loops weren't just memory. They were history repeating itself, preserved somewhere beyond his control. Michael told himself he would ignore the emails, but he couldn't. He searched, and what he found was worse than silence. In an old local news archive, he stumbled across a grainy clip, labeled only by date. A boy, maybe 12, stood on Main Street, looking up at the stone building with its iron letters. The camera shook, then steadied on his face. It was him, Michael. The same eyes, the same hesitant tilt of the chin, though younger, thinner, still unscarred by the years to come. In the background of the clip, a woman's voice whispered his name, clear enough to cut through decades of static. The headline beneath read only, Asterisk test footage. Not for release! He shut his laptop, trembling, unable to breathe. The footage shouldn't exist. No one had filmed him that day, and yet... there it was, undeniable, the hidden truth surfacing in plain sight. He thought about the spirals carved into benches, the chalk marks on the sidewalks, the messages that kept appearing in his own handwriting. He thought about the people who glanced at him in public as though they knew. Others had been through this before. Others were still inside it, scattered like him, circling, leaving signs, watching. The third voice returned once more. This time in handwriting, across a library book he borrowed without opening. On the inside cover, beneath the due date card, were the words, Asterisk, you were never the only one. We've been waiting for you to notice asterisk that night. Michael didn't dream. He woke at 3:17 again, the same frozen ton, and found his apartment filled with silence, too deep to belong to any human hour. He sat at his desk, papers spread before him, hands trembling, and realized he could feel the presence of the others. Not inside the room, but inside the story itself, watching, waiting for him to turn the next page. He wasn't sure if they were allies, strangers, or something else entirely, but he knew the loop was wider, more dangerous, threaded through more lives than his own. And if they were watching him, then maybe you were too. Because if you've come this far, if you've noticed the same symbols, if you've felt the memory glitch when a detail shifted, then you know it already. This was never his story alone. It has always been shared. It has always been waiting. And as Michael raised his eyes to the dark window, the condensation bloomed once more across the glass. But this time, it didn't carry a name. It carried a warning, scrawled from the inside out. You're next. Do you want me to carry this into the next chapter, where the observer steps forward as the only one claiming to tell the truth? Or let it linger here, where the audience themselves feel pulled into the conspiracy? Michael sat with the papers, spread around him like fragments of a shattered mirror, each one carrying a reflection that almost but not quite fit together. The building's name, the shifting dates, the face that appeared and disappeared depending on the hour, the voices captured on tapes. He didn't remember recording. For weeks, he had told himself he was trying to uncover what happened, what the fire was. What the woman meant, why Andrew had reappeared after all these years. But somewhere in the restless nights and fractured days, the question had changed. It wasn't about what happened anymore. It was asterisk. Why? Why had his life bent in this direction? Why had his memory become a sieve? Why did he feel like he'd been rehearsing the same nightmare across decades? The answer, if there was one, didn't come like thunder. It came like a whisper too close to his ear, like a breath against the back of his neck when no one stood behind him. It came with the admission he had been choking back since childhood that he had always known he was Zanti alone in this. He remembered the woman stepping from the building when he was 12, whispering his name like she had been waiting for him. He remembered telling his parents and being told to laugh it off. He remembered, deep down, believing them not because he thought they were right, but because it was easier to accept their lie than face the unbearable possibility that the world had cracked open just for him. That was his confession. Not that he had seen something impossible, but that he had chosen to forget. He had chosen comfort over truth. And maybe that was what this was all about. Not a ghost. Not a curse. Not even a conspiracy, though those pieces hung like shadows over every detail, but the simple human terror of knowing. The way people bend their own memories into shapes that don't hurt as much. The way silence feels safer than clarity. Michael realized that if this force, whatever it was, had been circling his life from the beginning, it wasn't just torment. It was a mirror. It had shown him, again and again, who he really was when faced with the unbearable. It had asked him a question he never dared answer. Do you want the truth, even if it destroys you? Andrew returned one final time. Not in person, but in voice. Michael woke in the middle of the night to his old cassette player worry on its own. Tape spinning, though. He hadn't pressed play. Andrew's voice came through. Calm. Measured. The same as always. Asterisk, you've solved it, Michael. Not the story, but yourself. That's all it ever was. You kept choosing to forget, and each time we started over. You know what happens? If you remember too much. Michael pressed his hands against his ears, but the voice burrowed deeper, no longer through the speaker but through the marrow of his bones. He screamed for it to stop, for the loop to break, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound, because in that silence, he realized the choice wasn't about finding answers, it was about whether to believe in his own survival. If he admitted the truth, if he allowed himself to fully remember, he might shatter. If he stayed in the blur, if he chose forgetting again, he might survive, but at the cost of never waking from the dream. The air grew heavy, almost alive, pressing in against him like the walls themselves were waiting. And in that wait, a new voice surfaced, not Andrew, not the woman, but something that felt older than both. It didn't speak in words so much as in understanding, pouring into him the knowledge he had been circling since the beginning. That this was never just his story, that others were caught in it, looping, forgetting, watching, that his every decision rippled into their lives the way theirs bled into his. That identity was never fixed, only borrowed, only carried until the next one stepped in. Michael collapsed against the table, sobbing, finally letting himself feel the terror he had numbed for years. He whispered into the dark that he didn't want this, that he wanted to be free. But the truth pressed back harder. Freedom wasn't forgetting. Freedom was carrying the unbearable weight and surviving it anyway. And maybe that was the hidden truth. No one wanted to remember, not that reality was haunted by some outside force, but that it was haunted by the parts of ourselves we buried to keep breathing. He opened his eyes, and for the first time, he didn't recognize his reflection in the window. Not blurred, not distorted, simply someone else entirely. A stranger who looked at him with the sorrow of someone who had lived this story before. The figure raised a hand, mirroring his movement exactly, and whispered words he couldn't hear but felt in his chest like a final verdict. He thought he saw his own lips move in sync, as if he were the reflection, not the man in the room. And that was the moment the truth clicked into place. He was Auntie. Waking from a dream, he was being woken. Pulled into the awareness that he might never have been the original at all. The clock on the wall struck 3:17 once more. Frozen, eternal, a reminder that the loop had no beginning and no end. Michael laughed. Then, not cruelly, but with the broken awe of someone staring directly at the abyss and recognizing himself in it. He understood, in that terrifying clarity, that the truth would both save and destroy Hemond. That the only choice left was whether to look away. The tape clicked off. The silence deepened. And somewhere, in the fragile space between memory and forgetting, you felt it to the sharp edge of waking, the recognition that maybe this isn't just his story, maybe it's yours. The screen fades to black. A voice lingers, soft, almost tender. as if spoken from just over your shoulder. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.